introducing me, Erin. I'm very happy to be here, and my talk, as you can see from the title, is actually based on a research project that was carried out in Nepal earlier this year with CCA's support. And the purpose of the research project was to examine, as a particular case study, the ways in which cooperatives in Nepal, women's cooperatives in particular, have promoted peace and served to mediate conflict. And time is very short, but I do want to take a minute to try and communicate what we mean when we talk about conflict or peace. Conflict can mean many things. It can range from interpersonal discord to a full-blown violent, bloody war or insurrection. And indeed, human beings have to actually negotiate conflict in many forms in their daily lives, and we wanted to get as broad an understanding of this as possible. So we thought we would employ a holistic understanding of conflict, and the definition of conflict that we decided to go with is a disagreement between two or more parties involving a perceived or actual physical, mental, or emotional threat to either or both parties' needs, interests, or concerns, or more generalized friction arising out of structural circumstances beyond the control of individuals or groups. And from this definition, it becomes obvious that the parties may involve individuals. It could be interpersonal conflict, or it could be social groups, or it could be national level conflict. And that it need not actually include physical violence and destruction, but circumstances in which the threat of physical, mental, or emotional violence is nevertheless present. And with this definition, it becomes possible to study conflict at multiple levels. So in our study in Nepal, we look at conflict at the micro level, which is at the intra-household or familial level. And these could be domestic violence, land disputes, marital conflict, etc. At the level of the immediate environment, or what I call the meso level, neighborhood, community, and this could include communal violence, crime, exploitation, discrimination, and so forth. And conflict at the macro level, at the national or regional level, which is basically war or civil war. And in addition to this, as Ian pointed out, peace is not just the absence of war. It's also, very necessary to have a society that is free of other structural forms of violence. And these structural forms of violence could be, in many ways, poverty, deprivation, social exclusion, discrimination, crime, corruption. All of these could contribute to structural conflict or structural violence, which could then lead to direct violence when, grievances or frustrations accumulate among people. And analogous to this understanding of conflict, we describe peace as, the definition states, as a situation characterized by the absence of direct violence, the threat of violence, hostility or other source of friction, as well as a situation of relative security in matters of socio-economic welfare and the acknowledgement of the principles of democracy, equality, and fairness in political relationships. So not just an absence of war or violence or conflict in the most direct sense, but also being committed to equality, socio-economic welfare, and this might include both intra-household amity as well as a generalized social harmony. So then the question arises, what is the link between women and peace building? Why look into that? And the second question, why look into women's cooperatives and peace building? And in response to the first question, one thing that may be raised, one aspect that may be raised is that the effects of intra-household conflict, violence, civil conflict, and structural violence are most felt by women in many cases. In the case of intra-household conflict, women are the victims of domestic violence most often. At the meso level, women face the impacts of gender and cultural norms and discrimination. And at the macro level, it's again women who are left behind to fend for themselves and their families. But at the same time, it's purely instrumental to argue that women should be the stakeholders and peace builders because they're also the bearers of the cost of conflict. A more crucial reason or argument, perhaps, to look into women and peace building would be that it is the participation and involvement of women that will result in the building of lasting peace in communities that are endemically afflicted by conflict. And this is something we can talk about more during the discussion as well. In response to the second question, why should we look into women's cooperatives and peace building? One argument is that peace building can be either top-down, which is basically organizations devising programs for reconstruction and peace building and allocating funds, or it could be a bottom-up approach, which basically involves and engages women and men at the grassroots level. And while both are crucial, I think cooperatives can play a pretty important role in this latter kind of grassroots, bottom-up peace building and building the consensus for peace. Secondly, I think there is a close link between peace and the cooperative movement, and Ian has already mentioned some of these links, so I won't go into that in too much detail. And women's cooperatives can actually be a platform for women to gather, to share their experiences of violence, and to undertake action on the basis of those shared experiences. I mean, where individual women's voices can be drowned out, there is an argument for collective resistance and unified action, and that might be another good argument to look into this link between women's cooperatives and peace building. Let me now take a quick second to describe what the context of conflict is in Nepal. Nepal is a small landlocked country in South Asia. And until recently, it had a monarchical form of government. It also emerged from a 10-year-long Maoist civil war in 2006, which basically resulted in widespread displacement, loss of property, loss of life, destruction of infrastructure. And in the post-ceasefire period and following its transition from monarchy to democracy, Nepal is actually faced with the massive task of formulating a new constitution. And this constitution is being formulated in a very politically unstable, charged, and not always harmonious setting. And this process was started in 2008 with popular elections being held for the Constituent Assembly. And it is in this context that this research project was carried out, and the purpose was basically to see how women's cooperatives have mobilized women members and enabled peace building at the grassroots level. We went to around 12 cooperatives in various parts of Nepal, in the eastern part, for instance, which is here, and also around Kathmandu and towards the west. 12 cooperatives and several women, about 50 women were interviewed, and focus groups were carried out to basically gather their own experiences with conflict and violence and their own experiences as peace builders. The following questions are central. First, how have women's cooperatives reduced violence and built peace in Nepal? Second, why have women's cooperatives been successful in building peace to the extent that they have been? Third, what are the pros of women's cooperatives taking up this work? And finally, what are the limits, dilemmas, challenges that women's cooperatives face in peace building? And this is how the rest of the talk is organized. In each case, I've tried to present women's own voices, actually, to the extent possible. How have women's cooperatives reduced violence and built peace? At the intra-household level or at the micro level, economic independence is often correlated to greater autonomy for women, and women have become not only more self-reliant, but it has also, as the quote reveals, improved the bargaining position within the household, and this has contributed to peace within the household. Another way of in which domestic violence and conflict have been prevented is through simply by being members of the cooperative. Awareness has increased, and this has contributed to the expansion of many women's horizons and have eliminated the petty source of conflict within the home. And in case of domestic violence emerging from alcoholism, addiction in local communities in Nepal, the cooperatives have not only supported women survivors of such violence, but also used collective action to prevent such violence from happening. At the meso level, various structural forms of inequality have been addressed by women's cooperatives, and some examples are given here. The second quote under gender-based discrimination points to the case of paralegal committees that cooperatives have formed, And that is a very significant development. These committees assist women with legal issues, file public interest litigation, and conflict mediation is also a service that these committees have provided. And in response to, again, caste and ethnic discrimination, which also actually contributed to fueling the Maoist conflict, several instances have emerged where women's cooperatives led by example, and simply by refusing to discriminate among its members, the cooperatives became more democratic spaces, and others in the community were also inspired to actively end caste and ethnic discrimination. And cooperatives are also trying to do away with exploitative practices, especially in rural Nepal. Money lending is actually a significant problem, and the cooperatives, by virtue of their activities, have prevented that to a very large extent. And at the macro level, even as the conflict was going on, most cooperatives were actually able to operate at the local level with relative ease, mostly because of their transparent structure. As Meera Bhattarai, who's been quoted here, says, we convinced them that the cooperative deals with poor women small amounts of money, and as a result it cannot give any donations. Since our accounts are transparent and we have a good social reputation, they were convinced and did not trouble us anymore. And they were able to continue operations, and they were able to contribute to a lot of awareness in the immediate aftermath of conflict. And this political education and consciousness raising is ongoing. Even though the conflict has formally ended, Nepal is far from stable, and cooperatives are still trying to play an active role in keeping the masses mobilized. So in light of these narratives, the question arises as to why cooperatives have been successful. And in my view, 4 factors may be responsible for this. For one, cooperatives have emerged as foundations of economic support. As I mentioned, they've contributed to increasing women's bargaining position within the house. Women are no longer dependent on the whims of men. They can make their own choices, and this has contributed to a huge increase in their self-reliance and their voice. Secondly, they're a source of collective strength and mobilization. Nepal is a strongly patriarchal society, and male domination actually extends to many aspects of the public and private spheres. And women's cooperatives have achieved their objectives through united, concerted action, and they've, as a result, been able to tackle some of these social ills collectively, where individual women might not have been able to deal with these. Cooperatives are platforms for women's voices and building awareness. And this we talked about earlier, so I'm not going to go into that. And finally, they have also emerged as practitioners of political neutrality and good politics. They have been very successful as external agents due to their commitment to political objectivity and neutrality, and have been able to convince the community of their commitment to nonpartisan politics. Finally, or not quite finally, but just as a sum up, what have been the pros of women's cooperatives undertaking peace building? As I said, grassroots change is one of them. Cooperatives have promoted social cohesion, especially by tackling gender, ethnic, caste discrimination. They've provided an alternative vision of a peaceful and just society, and have facilitated women's visibility, participation, leadership. But at the same time, some dilemmas also emerge and challenges, which I want to leave you with, and this is something we can come back to during discussion as well. The first one is that cooperatives can also be victims of violence or spaces of conflict. I mean, even as cooperatives emerge as peace builders in the case of Nepal, we cannot become too sanguine about their role or idolize them. In Nepal, at least, women's activism within the cooperative and outside has stigmatized them sometimes and made them objects of ridicule and harassment, especially in the initial stages. And in addition, the presumption that cooperatives have vast financial resources at their disposal makes them more vulnerable to attack or hostility. In other words, cooperatives are also very much placed in a social milieu and face the same constraints, opinions, and challenges that individual women do. A second challenge is that many actions that these, I'm just almost done, so I'm just going to take one more minute. Many of these actions that the cooperatives undertook were taken after particular episodes of violence, and I think there should be more of a focus on the prevention rather than on cure. More significantly, from a feminist perspective, I guess A significant dilemma occurs when we make these easy associations between women and peace building, and or naturalize peace building as women's domain, or part of women's skills. So even as women's cooperatives have built peace in many ways in their communities, you have to wonder whether gender role stereotypes are somehow being reaffirmed. And if they are, we have to ask this question on whether these skills, these peace-building skills, are being naturalized, and whether this work is placing additional burdens of time or energy on the women who are doing this work. And there are no ready solutions to this, but we could come back to this during discussion. I'm so sorry for going over time, but thank you very much.
No, that was great, Smita. Thank you so much, and certainly we will come back to that in the discussion period.